Memphis in August carries a particular weight. The air hangs low and thick, pressing against the city like something waiting to settle. On the night of August 15, 1977, temperatures hovered in the high 80s, well past midnight, and the humidity clung to everything. The streets, the trees, the white columns of a mansion, sitting on a hill at 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard. Behind those walls, behind the music gates with their iron silhouettes of a man and his guitar, the estate known as Graceland was awake. It was often awake at this hour. The rhythms inside had long since inverted. Daylight meant sleep. Darkness meant activity. And on this particular night, the man who owned the house, who had purchased it 2 decades earlier as a 22-year-old with more money than he knew what to do with, was restless. He had returned home around midnight from a visit to his dentist. Dental work at that hour was unremarkable by the standards of his life. Appointments happened when he wanted them. The world bent to his schedule, not the other way around. By the early morning hours, sometime after 4, he was on the racquetball court behind the mansion, playing with members of his entourage. The games were casual. He moved more slowly now than he once had. His weight had fluctuated for years, and at 42, his body no longer responded the way it did when he first shook it across television screens and concert stages. But he still played. He still sang between points, sometimes sitting at the piano in the court's lounge afterward, running through gospel songs and old ballads. Those who heard him that night would later say his voice remained untouched by whatever else had changed. He retired to his bedroom suite sometime around 7 in the morning. Ginger Alden, his girlfriend of several months, was already there. He told her he was going to the bathroom to read. This was not unusual. He often spent hours in the adjoining space, a large bathroom with a reading chair. She fell asleep. The house settled into its daytime silence. The hours that followed exist only in absence. No one checked on him. No one entered the room. The staff moved through their routines elsewhere in the house. His father, Vernon, lived in a separate residence on the property. His daughter, Lisa Marie, 9 years old, was staying at Graceland that week. But children keep different rhythms, and hers did not intersect with his that morning. The mansion was full of people, yet each occupied a separate corridor of its sprawling interior. It was approximately 2:20 in the afternoon when Ginger Alden woke and found the bathroom door still closed. She knocked. There was no answer. When she opened the door, she found him on the floor, face down, his body having fallen forward from the reading chair. She called for help. The intercom connected her to other parts of the house. Within moments, members of the staff arrived. Someone attempted resuscitation. Someone called for an ambulance. The paramedics who arrived at Graceland encountered a scene of controlled chaos. The man on the floor was unresponsive. His face had discolored. Rigor mortis, some would later suggest, had already begun to set in, though official accounts would dispute this. He was transported to Baptist Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where he had been treated numerous times over the years. Efforts to revive him continued en route. At 3:30 in the afternoon, he was pronounced dead. The official cause, as it would be recorded, was cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat leading to cardiac arrest. The underlying condition was attributed to hypertensive heart disease. The announcement was made to the press within hours. The word spread across radio stations and wire services with a speed that matched the magnitude of the name. Elvis Presley was dead. But even in those first hours, questions began to surface. The Baptist Memorial Medical Examiner, Dr. Jerry Francisco, held a press conference that evening. He stated that preliminary autopsy findings indicated no evidence of drug abuse. The death, he said, was natural, yet toxicology results had not been completed. Full autopsy findings would not be available for weeks, and when they did emerge, they would be sealed, locked away from public view by a legal maneuver that would keep them hidden for decades. Inside Graceland, The staff moved quickly. Phone calls were made. Visitors were controlled. The gates remained closed. Whatever had happened in that bathroom, whatever sequence of events had led to a 42-year-old man lying face down on the floor while the rest of the house slept, would be managed carefully. The official story was already forming, but stories once set in motion have a way of encountering friction, and this one would encounter more than most. The property had a history before he arrived. Built in 1939 for Dr. Thomas Moore and his wife Ruth, the Colonial Revival Mansion took its name from Ruth's aunt, Grace Toepf, whose family had owned the land since the 1890s. The house sat on nearly 14 acres of pasture and woodland south of Memphis, far enough from the city center to feel like country, but close enough to remain accessible. It was, by the standards of its time, a gentleman's estate. White columns, green shutters, a long driveway lined with oaks. The Moores lived there for nearly 2 decades before financial pressures forced a sale. In March of 1957, a young man with a recent string of hit records and a growing reputation for controversy made an offer of $100,000. He was 22 years old. His name had become synonymous with a new kind of music and a new kind of movement. Hips swaying on television, teenagers screaming in auditoriums, ministers warning congregations about moral decay. He had outgrown the modest homes of his childhood in Tupelo, Mississippi, and the small houses his family rented after moving to Memphis. He needed space. He needed gates. He needed walls. Graceland provided all three. The purchase closed in April, and he moved in with his parents, Vernon and Gladys, shortly thereafter. The house was renovated extensively over the following months. Rooms were redecorated according to his tastes, which ran toward the ornate and the personal. The living room acquired a 15-foot white couch. The dining room was fitted with custom furniture. A soda fountain was installed in the basement, a remnant of the drugstore culture he had grown up around. Outside, the grounds were fenced, and the now famous music gates were erected at the entrance, wrought iron panels depicting the man himself with a guitar, musical notes floating around him. From the beginning, Graceland was more than a residence. It was a fortress. The fame that had descended upon him in 1956, following appearances on national television and the release of records that sold in quantities the industry had never seen, brought with it a kind of siege. Fans gathered outside the gates daily. Some camped overnight. Others drove past slowly, hoping for a glimpse. The attention was relentless, and it shaped the architecture of his life. The walls of Graceland became the boundary between public existence and private refuge, though the distinction would blur over time. His mother, Gladys, never fully adjusted to the house. She had spent her life in poverty, in shotgun shacks and public housing, and the sudden elevation to mansion living unsettled her. She worried about her son, about the people surrounding him, about the speed at which everything was changing. Her health, never robust, declined steadily after the move. In August of 1958, just over a year after they had settled into Graceland, she died of a heart attack at the age of 46. He was in Texas at the time, completing basic training for the Army, having been drafted earlier that year. He returned to Memphis for the funeral and was photographed weeping openly at the graveside. She was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, though her remains would later be moved to Graceland itself. Her death marked a turning point. Those who knew him before and after often described the change in similar terms. Something closed off. The openness that had characterized his early interactions with fans and press gave way to something more guarded. Graceland, which had been intended as a family home, became a space defined by her absence. Her bedroom was preserved, her belongings remained, and the house in some fundamental way became a monument to loss, even as it continued to serve as headquarters for an expanding empire. The Army years took him to Germany, where he served until 1960. Graceland sat waiting. Vernon oversaw the property in his absence, managing the staff and the finances, with varying degrees of competence. When the discharge came, the return to Memphis was triumphant in its way, but the industry he returned to had shifted. Rock and roll had softened. The raw energy of the mid-50s had given way to cleaner sounds, smoother performers. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, steered him toward Hollywood, and the early 60s became a blur of film contracts. 3 pictures a year, formulaic plots, soundtrack albums that sold reliably but lacked the danger of his earlier work. Graceland during these years functioned as a way station. He would return between film shoots, gathering his entourage around him, hosting all-night parties and impromptu football games on the front lawn. The group that surrounded him, young men from Memphis, friends from his early days, employees who became companions, grew into a permanent fixture. They lived in the house or in nearby accommodations. They traveled with him. They ate with him, watched movies with him, followed his schedule. The press would eventually give them a name, the Memphis Mafia. The term carried implications of loyalty and insularity, of a closed circle operating by its own rules. Both implications were accurate. The inner circle operated according to unwritten codes. Loyalty was paramount, discretion was expected, and proximity to him, physical, social, emotional, determined one's standing within the hierarchy. The men who comprised this group held various official titles: bodyguard, driver, personal assistant, tour manager. But the titles obscured the more fundamental nature of the arrangement. They were companions in a life that had become too strange, too isolated, too removed from ordinary experience to be navigated alone. He paid them salaries. He bought them cars, sometimes on impulse, sometimes in clusters. Cadillacs for everyone, handed out like party favors. In return, they provided presents. They filled the rooms of Graceland with activity, with noise, with the simulation of normalcy. The economics of this arrangement were handled loosely. Vernon Presley managed the finances, though his qualifications for the role extended no further than being the father of the man who earned the money. Expenses were paid from accounts that Vernon oversaw, with a frugality born of his Depression-era upbringing, which often clashed with his son's instinct toward extravagance. The tension between them on financial matters was persistent, but rarely confrontational. Vernon understood his position. The money was not his. The house was not his. His authority derived entirely from his son's willingness to grant it, and that willingness had limits. Colonel Tom Parker occupied a different position entirely. The manager had guided the career since 1955, negotiating contracts, booking tours, orchestrating the transition from regional phenomenon to national obsession. His methods were unorthodox. His background was obscure. He claimed to be from West Virginia, but evidence would later suggest he was born in the Netherlands and had entered the United States illegally, a fact that, if true, would explain his reluctance to allow his client to perform internationally. The colonel took a percentage of earnings that industry observers considered excessive, eventually reaching 50% of most income streams. But the partnership endured, bound by contracts and by something harder to define, a mutual dependence that neither man seemed able or willing to break. The question of control within this arrangement remains contested. Parker made decisions about career direction, about which films to accept, about touring schedules and merchandise. But the control was not absolute. The man at the center retained veto power, at least in theory. He could have refused the film contracts that he reportedly despised. He could have demanded different material, different directors, different terms. That he did not, that the 1960s became a procession of interchangeable movies with forgettable songs, suggests something more complicated than simple manipulation. There was passivity in it, perhaps, or exhaustion, or a recognition that the machinery had grown too large to redirect. Graceland reflected these tensions. The house was his domain. the one space where Parker's influence did not penetrate directly. But it was also a space shaped by avoidance. Serious conversations about career direction rarely occurred there. Business was conducted elsewhere, in Los Angeles offices or Las Vegas hotel suites. Graceland was for leisure, for escape, for the maintenance of a world that existed parallel to the industry that funded it. The nightly gatherings, the film screenings in the basement theater, the rides on golf carts around the property. These were the rituals of a life deliberately constructed to exclude the pressures waiting outside the gates. In May of 1967, he married Priscilla Beaulieu in a private ceremony in Las Vegas. They had met in Germany during his army service when she was 14 and he was 24. The relationship had continued across the intervening years, with her eventually moving to Memphis to be near him, finishing high school while living in a house supervised by his family. The marriage was presented to the public as a fairy tale, the wholesome union of a star and his longtime sweetheart. The reality was more complex. Priscilla would later describe the years at Graceland in terms that suggested confinement as much as partnership. His schedule dominated, his preferences dictated. The life she entered was not one she had designed. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born exactly 9 months after the wedding, in February of 1968. The birth was celebrated publicly, another chapter in the narrative of American royalty that had been constructed around him. Privately, the arrival of a child changed the dynamics at Graceland only marginally. The entourage remained. The nocturnal schedule persisted. Fatherhood for him existed within the same framework that governed everything else, performed in bursts of affection, then receding behind the demands of work and the habits of isolation. The year 1968 marked a pivot. The films had grown stale. The soundtrack albums sold less with each release. The cultural landscape had shifted beneath him, while he remained fixed in place, grinding through contractual obligations in Hollywood soundstages. The Beatles had arrived. Dylan had electrified. The counterculture was reshaping popular music into something political, experimental, confrontational. He had become, in the eyes of many observers, a relic, a figure from an earlier era, preserved in the amber of mediocre cinema and safe, forgettable songs. The television special that aired in December of that year was intended as a corrective. Sponsored by Singer Sewing Company, produced by Bob Finkel, and directed by Steve Binder, the program was initially conceived as a traditional Christmas broadcast. Binder pushed for something different. He wanted to strip away the accumulated years of compromise, to return to the raw performer who had scandalized and electrified the nation a decade earlier. The result was a broadcast that would later be known simply as the Comeback Special. The most remembered sequences were filmed in the round, with a small audience seated inches from the stage. He wore black leather. He sweated under the lights. He played with musicians who had known him before the army, before Hollywood, before the machinery had overtaken the music. The performance was loose, improvisational, punctuated by laughter and false starts, and moments of genuine discovery. Watching the footage decades later, one sees something that had been absent from his public appearances for years: engagement. He was present in a way the films had never allowed. The special drew massive ratings. Critical response was enthusiastic, and the success opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. By 1969, he had returned to the recording studio in Memphis, cutting tracks at American Sound Studio that would yield some of his most acclaimed work in years. Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, Kentucky Rain. The songs were contemporary in arrangement, emotionally direct, commercially successful. The narrative of decline was, for a moment, reversed. That summer, he opened at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, beginning a residency that would define the final chapter of his performing career. The engagement was a gamble. He had not performed live before a paying audience since 1961. Vegas was a particular kind of stage, adult, sophisticated, potentially unforgiving. The shows were triumphant. Critics praised his energy, his voice, his command of the room. Audiences responded with the kind of fervor that had characterized his earliest concerts. The International extended his contract. The pattern was set. Las Vegas would become his primary performance venue for the next 7 years. But patterns, once established, tend toward repetition. The initial Vegas engagements were events. By the mid-1970s, they had become routines. The shows followed predictable structures. The set lists varied little. The jumpsuits grew more elaborate. Rhinestones, capes, high collars, as if the costumes could compensate for something that was diminishing beneath them. He performed hundreds of shows, sometimes 2 a night, cycling through the same songs while the audiences cycled through their seats. The economics were favorable. The artistic returns were less clear. The marriage, meanwhile, had fractured. Priscilla would later describe a relationship that had become untenable, the long absences, the entourage that never dispersed, the growing distance between them even when physically present. In 1972, she left. The divorce was finalized the following year, handled with a discretion that kept the most damaging details from public view. Custody of Lisa Marie was shared. The financial settlement was substantial, and Graceland, which had been their home together, reverted to its earlier configuration: his house, his staff, his rules. The departures extended beyond marriage. Several members of the inner circle left during this period, some pushed out after conflicts with Vernon or with newer arrivals, others departing on their own terms. The group that had surrounded him since the early 1960s was thinning, replaced in part by figures whose loyalty was less tested, whose judgment was less trusted by those who had known him longer. The insularity that had always characterized life at Graceland intensified. The gates remained closed, the schedule remained inverted, and the outside world, with its questions and concerns, remained outside. The medications had been present for years. The exact timeline of their introduction into his daily life remains difficult to establish with precision, but accounts from those who knew him suggest that prescription drug use became significant during the 1960s and escalated steadily thereafter. The categories were various: amphetamines to provide energy, barbiturates to allow sleep, pain medications to address the physical toll of performances, sedatives to quiet the mind. The prescriptions came from physicians, sometimes multiple physicians simultaneously, each perhaps unaware of what others were providing. Dr. George Nikopoulos, known as Dr. Nick, became his primary physician in 1967 and would remain in that role until the end. The relationship was unusual by conventional medical standards. Dr. Nick traveled with him on tour. Dr. Nick visited Graceland regularly. Dr. Nick dispensed medications in quantities that would later draw scrutiny from medical boards and law enforcement. In the final months alone, records would indicate thousands of doses prescribed across multiple drug categories. Whether this represented treatment, enabling, or some combination of both depends on perspective and remains a subject of dispute. Dr. Nick would later defend his practices as harm reduction, arguing that without his oversight, the patient would have obtained substances through more dangerous channels. The physical toll became visible by the mid-1970s. His weight fluctuated dramatically, sometimes gaining and losing significant amounts within the span of weeks. His face grew puffy. His movements on stage, once fluid and provocative, became labored. Concert footage from this period shows a man struggling against his own body, sweating through jumpsuits that had been designed for a different physique, occasionally slurring words or losing track of lyrics. Some performances were cancelled, others proceeded despite visible impairment. The audiences came regardless. The shows sold out regardless. The machinery continued to function, even as its central component deteriorated. Within Graceland, the decline was managed rather than addressed. The staff adapted to his condition. The inner circle accommodated his needs, whatever those needs might be at any given hour. Meals were prepared according to his preferences, which ran toward the excessive, fried foods, heavy starches, the rich southern cooking of his childhood, consumed in quantities that bore no relation to nutritional guidance. Sleep came when the medications allowed it. Waking followed its own unpredictable rhythm. The house operated as a support system for patterns that were, by any objective measure, unsustainable. The question of intervention arises naturally when examining this period. Why did no one stop it? Why did those closest to him not force a reckoning with the trajectory he was on? The answers are multiple and overlapping. Some tried and were rebuffed. The temper that had always been part of his personality grew more volatile during these years, and disagreement could result in banishment from the inner circle. Others rationalized that their presence was itself protective, that remaining close allowed them to moderate excesses they could not eliminate. Still others may have benefited too directly from the arrangement to risk disrupting it. Employment, access, proximity to fame, these were powerful incentives for accommodation. Vernon Presley watched his son's decline from the house he occupied on the Graceland grounds. The father had suffered his own health crisis, a heart attack in 1975 that left him weakened and less capable of managing the business affairs he had overseen for 2 decades. His authority, never absolute, diminished further. The relationship between father and son had always contained complexities. Vernon's prison term during Elvis's childhood, the poverty they had shared, the sudden reversal of fortune that made the son the provider and the father the dependent. Whatever conversations passed between them during the final years, whatever warnings Vernon may have offered or withheld, remained private. Colonel Parker continued to book tours. The economics demanded it. The expenses of maintaining Graceland, of supporting the entourage, of funding the lifestyle that had grown around him, required constant income. The Las Vegas residencies provided substantial revenue, but were not sufficient alone. Road tours filled the gaps, carrying him across the country to arenas and stadiums where audiences paid premium prices to see a legend, even a diminished one. The schedule was punishing for a healthy performer. For one in his condition, it was something else entirely. But the shows continued. The contracts were honored. The machine ground forward. The book appeared in the summer of 1977, titled Elvis, What Happened? It was written by Steve Dunleavy, based on extensive interviews with 3 former members of the Inner Circle, Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler. All 3 had been dismissed from employment the previous year, ostensibly as a cost-cutting measure implemented by Vernon. The timing and manner of their departure left wounds that had not healed. The book was their response. The contents were explosive by the standards of celebrity biography in that era. Drug use was detailed extensively. Volatile behavior was documented. Incidents of violence and paranoia were recounted. The portrait that emerged was of a man unraveling, surrounded by enablers, insulated from consequences by fame and wealth. The authors claimed their motivation was concern, that by exposing the reality, they might shock him into seeking help. Whether this justification was sincere or retrospective remains a matter of interpretation. The book was scheduled for publication on August 1, 1977. He was aware of its impending release. Those around him reported that the knowledge caused significant distress. The final tour began that summer. The schedule called for performances across the Northeast and South, a sequence of one-night stands in cities he had played dozens of times before. The shows varied in quality. Some nights, he summoned reserves of energy that surprised even those who had watched his decline most closely. Other nights, the struggle was evident. A performance in Baltimore on June 1st was filmed for CBS, intended for a television special. The footage captures something difficult to watch. A performer clearly unwell, bloated and breathless, yet still capable of moments that recalled his former power. The special would air after his death, edited to minimize the most troubling sequences. Between tour dates, he returned to Graceland. The pattern of those final weeks followed the template established over years: late nights, extended sleep, medications administered on schedules, known only to those responsible for dispensing them. The house staff maintained their routines. The gates remained closed to all but approved visitors. Whatever he was feeling about the impending book, about his health, about the trajectory of his life, he expressed only intermittently and to select confidants. Ginger Alden had entered his life in November of 1976. She was 20 years old when they met, a former beauty queen whose sister had previously dated one of his associates. The relationship progressed rapidly by external measures. She was living at Graceland within weeks, wearing an engagement ring by January of 1977. Those who observed the relationship offered varying assessments. Some saw genuine affection. Others saw a pattern repeating: the attraction to youth, the desire for companionship without complication, the need to have someone present in the hours when loneliness pressed hardest. The summer heat of 1977 bore down on Memphis with customary weight. The house at the end of Elvis Presley Boulevard continued its sealed existence, air conditioning maintaining artificial climate while the world outside sweltered. He was scheduled to depart on another tour leg on August 16th. The itinerary would take him to Portland, Maine, as the first stop, followed by additional dates through the end of the month. His costumes had been prepared. The band had been assembled. The logistics of moving an entourage across the country had been arranged with the precision that such operations required. On August 15th, he visited his dentist, Dr. Lester Hoffman, sometime around 10:30 in the evening. Dental appointments at such hours were consistent with his inverted schedule. The visit addressed ongoing issues. His teeth had suffered from years of neglect and dietary habits. He returned to Graceland around midnight. The hours that followed were occupied by the racquetball game mentioned by those who saw him last, the piano playing in the early morning, the gradual winding down of another night that was indistinguishable from countless nights before it. He spoke to Ginger Alden before retiring to the bathroom. He mentioned that he would read for a while. The book he carried with him was, according to some accounts, a text on the Shroud of Turin, reflecting the spiritual interests that had occupied him increasingly in later years. He had explored various religious traditions, accumulated libraries of metaphysical texts, sought answers to questions that fame and wealth had not resolved. What he found in those pages, what comfort or confusion they provided, belongs to the private territory that no account can fully access. The bathroom door opened sometime after 2 in the afternoon. What Ginger Alden found on the other side would become the subject of depositions, interviews, and endless speculation in the decades that followed. The position of the body, the condition of the face, the items present in the room. Each detail would be examined, contested, incorporated into theories that ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. The official account: cardiac arrhythmia, natural causes, a heart that simply stopped, would satisfy some and provoke others to investigations that continue to the present day. The toxicology results, when finally conducted, revealed the presence of multiple substances in his system. The precise findings remained sealed for years, accessible only through leaks and legal proceedings that gradually pried open the official record. Codeine, morphine, Demerol, Quaaludes, Valium, Placidil. The list read like an inventory of pharmaceutical intervention. Whether these substances caused his death, contributed to it, or merely accompanied a cardiac event that would have occurred regardless, became the central question that no authority would definitively resolve. Dr. Nikopoulos faced scrutiny. The medical board examined his prescribing practices. Criminal charges were filed and ultimately dismissed. His license would later be revoked, though not until 1995, nearly 2 decades after the death he had been unable to prevent. The legal proceedings generated testimony and documentation that added layers to the historical record without resolving its fundamental ambiguities. Graceland itself entered a different phase of existence. Vernon Presley managed the estate until his own death in 1979. Ownership passed to Lisa Marie, still a child, with trustees overseeing operations until her adulthood. By 1982, facing financial pressures that threatened the property itself, the decision was made to open Graceland to the public. The house that had been constructed as a refuge from attention became an attraction, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The rooms were preserved: the jungle room, the television room, the graves in the meditation garden, where he was interred alongside his mother, his father, his grandmother. The tourists came, and still come, filing through spaces where the private had become permanently public. They photograph the furniture, they read the plaques, they purchase souvenirs from the shops that now occupy the grounds across the street. What they encounter is a version of history, curated and controlled, the difficult passages smoothed into narrative suitable for general audiences. The medications are mentioned. The decline is acknowledged. But the house itself presents as a monument rather than a crime scene, a celebration rather than a cautionary document. The questions that surrounded August 16, 1977, have never fully dissipated. Books continue to appear, offering new theories, new witnesses, new interpretations of evidence long since fixed in the official record. Some propose murder, some propose suicide, some propose negligence rising to the level of culpability. The official cause of death remains cardiac arrhythmia, undisturbed by decades of challenge. Memphis keeps its own counsel. The boulevard that bears his name runs past the gates each day, traffic flowing toward destinations that have nothing to do with the history contained behind the walls. The music gates stand open during the visiting hours, closed at night when the house returns to something like its original silence. The rooms hold their arrangements. The grave receives its flowers. And whatever happened in those final hours remains where it has always been, suspended between the official version and the void it was constructed to conceal.